Good evening. I'm David Cataforis, Professor and Chair of Art History at the University of Kansas. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Kansas resides on the ancestral territory of the Kaw people, who were progressively forced off their land by the United States in the 19th century and largely relocated to Oklahoma. This land acknowledgement recognizes that Native Americans are traditional guardians of the land, and it recognizes the enduring relationship between Native peoples and these traditional territories. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first lecture in our series, Intersections of Identity, Expression, Exchange, and Hybridity. The series asks what constitutes identity and how do people navigate, form, and reform their sense of self? And how can the study of art and its history help us to consider the diverse identities expressed by visual culture and its creators? We seek to amplify the voices of scholars and artists whose work explores individual and collective identities as those intersect with notions of the body, disability, gender, heritage, and race. The series is organized by KU's Crest Foundation Department of Art History and our History of Art Graduate Students Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. It is sponsored by the Franklin Murphy Lecture Fund. We presented in partnership with the Spencer Museum of Art, the KU Department of Visual Art, Lawrence Art Center, Lawrence Public Library, Raven Bookstore, Black Lawrence, and other community and KU partners. I want to thank KU Art History Department Office Manager Lisa Clore for all of her organizational help, and also acknowledge the creator of the poster for this evening's lecture, KU student Natalie Lapere. Now I will introduce our speaker, Norman Akers. He was born and raised in Fairfax, Oklahoma. He is a citizen of the Osage Nation from Gray Horse District. He's currently Associate Professor of Painting and Drawing at the University of Kansas and previously taught at the Institute of American Indian Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Norman Akers holds a BFA in painting from the Kansas City Art Institute, a certificate in museum studies from the Institute of American Indian Arts, and an MFA in fine arts from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's had numerous solo exhibitions, including at the Lawrence Art Center, iSpace in Chicago, the Gardner Art Gallery at Oklahoma State University, and currently at Sherry Leedy Contemporary in Kansas City. He has participated in many group exhibitions, including most recently, Monarchs, Brown and Native Contemporary Artists in the Path of the Butterfly at the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art in Overland Park, Kansas, and Art for New Understanding, Native Voices 1950s to Now, organized by the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. Norman Akers' paintings are in several collections, including the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, the Heard Museum in Phoenix, the Idle York Museum in Indianapolis, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. The Spencer Museum of Art owns several of his prints. In 2007, he was selected to participate in the We Are All Knots print project, sponsored by the National Museum of the American Indian and Art in the Embassy's program print series. He was a recipient of the Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Grant in 1999. Tonight, Norman Akers will give a talk entitled Okesa, Halfway There. After his talk, we'll have a question and answer session moderated by members of KU's History of Art Graduate Students Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. So please, over the course of the lecture, type any questions you have for Norman Akers into the question and answer box on YouTube, and you can continue to type those questions following the lecture during the Q&A. The moderators will read your questions to Norman, and he will answer them. So with no further ado, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Norman Akers.
Good evening, and David, thank you for the marvelous introduction. And I have to express that it's an honor to be asked to share my work with everyone this evening. The title of my talk is Okesa, Halfway There. And I chose that title for a couple of reasons. One of the things I have to express to you is that that word Okesa means halfway in Osage. But there's also a little town called Okesa in between Pawhuska and Bartlesville. And I kept on noticing it on a map. And I was really fascinated with the fact that it was kind of halfway in between places. And, you know, my heritage is I'm Osage and I'm also Anglo. My father was Osage and my mother was Anglo. And so that really does play a role in my work and how I sort of see the world. In 2009, I came to Kansas, to KU, and I want to kind of share a little bit of that experience of traveling to Kansas with you. I was teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I was asked to do a show at the Lawrence Arts Center. And I remembered I was driving my paintings to Lawrence, and just west of Emporia, I noticed the tall grass prairie and the Flint Hills. And my first response was that, you know, this is a lot like home. And that just caught my attention. And it was sort of welcoming as I was moving east, you know, towards Lawrence. And, you know, one of the reasons why I chose to leave New Mexico and go to KU is it put me a little bit closer to home. And also ancestral Osage lands. And so I made that transition back then. And as said, it's been just an incredibly good transition. And I enjoyed my time here in Lawrence. I'm going to move on to an image here. And this kind of gives you a sense of the landscape where I was raised. I grew up in the western Osage, and it's the very southern tip of the tall grass prairie and the Flint Hills. And so this country is something that really sort of resonates with me. I like to kind of share this story because it's about traveling. And for some reason, my work really kind of deals with that notion of moving from one place, you know, to another. And I make a number of trips, you know, from Lawrence to Oklahoma. And I think part of this is a tribal person. I find that there's still responsibilities that I have to home and community. And so I'm constantly, as I said, kind of going back and forth. I travel on Highway 99 up in Kansas, and that basically goes south down into Oklahoma. You know, one of the things that always strikes me about it is the land makes it feel like an umbilical cord. I know I'm going home. And there's something really, as I said, sort of soothing about that. But one of the things that happens on this trip is as I'm getting closer to the border and entering Oklahoma, I see this sign that says, "Leaving Kansas, come again." And it, you know, when I was first making those trips, I wasn't really thinking about it that much. And then all of a sudden it started kind of sinking in. And I was going, you know, leaving Kansas, come again. You know, Osages, we lived in Kansas. That was our last, you know, reservation or reserve called the Osage Diminished Reserve before we moved to Oklahoma. And the next sign that I see is "Welcome to Oklahoma, Native America. You are entering the Osage Nation Reservation, and welcome to Osage County." And, you know, within just a quarter of a mile, I see all of this signage. And I start to realize it conveys something about our history as Osage people. But also the signage, it's still about political entities trying to define a land that we call home. And you know, as I said, that's been something that has been kind of playing a role in my work for a while. You know, one of the things I will say about this is growing up in the Osage, when I was younger, we used to travel dirt roads and gravel roads, and that was just kind of how we entertained ourselves. And the beauty about this is that I can actually kind of go west of this area, and I can get on a gravel road and I can travel to my home in Fairfax. And most of the trip is on this gravel road. But one of the things is I'm entering Oklahoma from Kansas. There's no signs. It's sort of seamless. There's tall grass prairie and flint hills. And I don't have this reminder of those borders and boundaries that have been set in place. And as I said, again, there's something sort of comforting about that, but also at the same time, you know, that feeling begins to make me question about how I defined what home is. And, you know, the fact that that as an Osage person, we had traditional lands outside of this area, you know, I still want to kind of be aware of that. I'm going to show another image, and I'll show you a map a little bit later of our traditional homelands. The other thing I wanted to sort of acknowledge too is this is a photograph of my grandma Eva and her sisters. And, you know, there's something about this image that I've just always loved. You know, there's something about the expression of the three women. And also at the same time, I sort of realized that this is, it's an old picture. And, you know, it sort of puts us back in a certain time frame. But yet, personally, I feel a very strong connection to that, because one of the things I have to sort of say about Osage people is we talk about how our ancestors put things in order for us to live a good life. And my grandma Eva was that person who did that for me at a very young age. And she set certain things up, and she did certain things, including putting me in Arielonshka when I was really quite young. And I have to just sort of acknowledge that. You know, also at the same time, one of the things that I find when you're looking at older images, and also you realize that the landscape, the image that I showed you just a little bit earlier, is kind of clean and pristine. And yet the reality of our lands back at home have sort of been scarred by oil production and this sort of history of that industry. And yet, in some ways, I'm sort of romanticizing this, this place that I call home. And, you know, I realize that, you know, when I'm showing these images, and also I realize that there's another history that these particular images don't show. And we can talk about that a bit later. Move on to another image. This is a few maps. One that you see on the left here is traditional Osage homelands. And at that point of contact in the 1600s, 1670s, the Osages pretty much inhabited Missouri, southeast Kansas, northwest Arkansas, and northeast Oklahoma. And this really, in a sense, was our traditional homelands. And so this kind of gives you a sense of the scope of our land. And of course, right in this area here, you know, is Lawrence, and then right here is where I live. And so I'm always making this transition, you know, back and forth. The other image that you see here is an image of the Osage universe. It's a diagram, and it's really our creation story. And one of the things I'll sort of explain about this diagram is that this image right here of the tree is a red oak tree. There's a series of 4 worlds. There's a river, a cedar tree, the sun, the moon, the Pleiades, a hatchet, a pipe, and these are all, you know, part of this story. I want to share something too, is that, you know, my interest in maps actually started when I was really quite young. When I was little, I used to collect maps. And I kept them in a box underneath my bed, and I would look at them and I would imagine place. And at that time in my life, the world was pretty small, and I really didn't even think I would ever see these places when I was little. And then about 15 years ago, when the maps started coming back into my paintings, I started kind of thinking about that, and I went, oh, that's interesting. And this kind of connection between the past, you know, and the present. But part of what I wanted to do when I show this picture of the Osage universe is that there's certain elements that become a part of my work. And one of the things I have to clarify, the story of Genesis was the first creation story that I really heard. You know, it wasn't this Osage creation story. And, you know, that kind of, you know, as I said, it was of an interest to me. I think, you know, one of the things that I'm very much interested in with my work is that notion of narrative or storytelling and where information comes from. Um, I do think about Osage people, and I think about this sort of oral history. And granted that there's been quite a bit written about Osages, even back in the early part of the 20th century when Francis LaFlèche, he was an Omaha man, came down to the Osage, and he recorded a lot of information from those elders at that time. And so there's been quite a bit of research, you know, on our tribe. And yet, as an academic, I realized that I'm engaged in that type of research, but I'm also intrigued with this oral history and stories that have sort of been handed down, or stories that come about from participating in the culture for many, many years. And so I really think about this when I'm sort of collecting information, you know, for my work. And one of the things too about this, I'm going to move on here real quick. I want to show a few more maps too here. This is an old map of the Osage around the 1920s, and it shows our three villages, Pasuli, Wakakali, and Sansoli. And yet, you know, what fascinates me about this map too is that we primarily see rivers and the railroad. And you have to realize that cartographers, you know, have usually an intention when they're creating a map. And of course, maps are designed to guide us and to allow us to move through territories and places. But there's also kind of a sinister side to maps, and is that they sort of echo and record colonization. You know, this whole sense of, you know, for us, our land's kind of being taken over, you know, for the most part. The map that's next to it is a map of Osage County in the 1990s. And it's a Rand McNally map. And what strikes me about this particular map is you see the overlay of roads. You see the reservoirs that have been put in place. You see new place names. Also, some of these names disappear, you know, too. You know, Pasoli, you know, you're looking at Gray Horse, you know, here. And this is the district of Osage where I come from. And also what struck me about these Rand McNally maps is I've been looking at them for years, and this is one from the 1990s, and it says Osage Indian Reservation. More recent maps, you see Osage Nation, and then you see Osage Tribe. And I start to realize, again, that name for our land is changing. And with those transitions, it starts to feel like we're almost being removed from that place. One of the things that's sort of unique about the Osage is that we actually bought our land in Oklahoma. And so we owned it, and we kept it communally until 1906 when we had the Osage allotment. And this was right before statehood. And our elders had the wise, they were wise enough that they kept actually the mineral rights, to the land. But yet with allotment, a lot of the surface rights were sold, or the surface of the land. And so we're really, in a sense, checkerboarded, where, it's like my sister and I, we still own our family's allotments. My cousins do too, as well. And to me, that's always been a sign of pride that we've never released that land. And yet, there's this dilemma, because at statehood, the state just sort of considers us Osage County, but you still look on federal maps and it says Osage Indian Reservation. And so, there's this whole history of kind of connected to maps, and how they sort of reinforce this whole sense of colonialism, and removal. I'm going to move on here. I also want to talk a little bit about my practice, because when I start to work with maps, I'm intrigued with the borders and boundaries that have been put in place by conquest and politics. But when I work with maps, I like to sort of skew the borders and move them around and try to imagine a place, kind of a sense like when I'm crossing Kansas into Oklahoma, west of Highway 99, where there's no signage, where I get this sense of that those borders have kind of disappeared. Just a little clue about my process. I've always been a painter and a printmaker, and I traditionally drew out of the used a sketchbook, and I did a lot of drawing. But roughly about 15 years ago, I started thinking about digital images, and I actually now do a lot of work with collage and taking photographs in Photoshop and manipulating images. I keep this sort of plastic globe, inflatable globe, which is deflated, in my studio. And the beauty about that is I can pick it up and I can twist it and I can turn it, and I can move the borders around and change things. And then I photograph it, and then I meticulously go in and clean up that image to get these maps like you're seeing on the right. And yet there's something about this investigation on the computer when I'm moving across this sort of this image of land and place, is that, I'm navigating it, for the most part. And so so I come up with a lot of these images, like what's on the right, and they become part of my my works. And so in one way, this is part of how I'm looking at, creating at least my prints. The other thing that I find about the act of collage in my work is that when I'm taking components and I'm moving them around, I'm physically trying to find a location or a place. And so when I'm moving images that I'm working with across these maps, and you'll see this a little bit later in some of the paintings that I'm showing, I'm really trying to find a placement. And there's something about, I think all of my life, I've looked and I've tried and I've searched, I've been searching. And sometimes I don't know what that is, what I'm looking for always. But that notion of searching and looking, I think, has always been important. I'm going to move on to a really early painting from around 1990. It's called Collision of Heavenly Structures. And if you take a close look at this painting, as you see the diagram of the Osage universe, and but that diagram is sort of skewed, it's twisted, it's in a chaotic world. And I have always kind of had to sort of think about this. Is this about something being broken down as a result of sort of two cultures colliding? Or is it about something restructuring itself? And I still kind of tend to battle with that. One of the things I will sort of say about Osage people is that we're very forward-moving people. We understand that our past and our history and our traditions form who we are as people. But also at the same time, we don't necessarily dwell on the past. Is that we're constantly, as I said, moving forward. I mean, there's a reality. We go from day to night. We go from spring, summer, fall, winter, and so there's this consistent movement. And nature doesn't go backwards. And so that's something I always have to kind of keep in mind when I'm looking at my work and making work. One of the things that I've always had some concerns about is that when I look at certain creation stories like that and visual elements from those stories, I'm not interested in illustrating the past. I have no desire to do that. What I'm doing is I'm searching and I'm trying to find something that has meaning to who I am, today. And I'll share this story. Many years ago, I was doing a talk at OU, and there was an elder man from our tribe who came to my talk. And this was the first time I had really started kind of exploring this personal symbolism. And I was showing paintings like the one you're seeing right now. And he was the type of person, he would tell you what was on his mind. He never held back. And he sat in the back of the lecture, and I have to admit, I was nervous. I was really kind of nervous about this. And then when the talk was over with, he came to me and he said, Norman, he says, I want to take you to lunch. I said, I just want to talk to you. And I was kind of worried a little bit. I said it was, it was bothering me a bit. And at lunch, he made a comment. He said, Norman, he says, you're trying to figure out the world that you live in. And he says, you're looking at the past and you're looking at these stories and you're looking at, and you're making these paintings. And he said, what you're doing is simply trying to figure out the world that you live in. And, he talked about how, in our culture, we sort of honored, veterans and people who served in the armed forces, and I said, that's something that's very important, I think, to Native peoples. And he made a comment, he said, but sometimes people forget we were philosophers and we thought about the world that we lived in. And, when you think about narratives and stories and sayings, in many cases, those sayings that come from tribal communities help us sort of understand the world we live in. It kind of functions as science almost. And so this painting is actually quite a large painting, and it took about 1.5 years to paint. It started off as a horizontal landscape and then ended up becoming vertical. And I started realizing that this vertical element is always important in my work. I like the notion of sky and earth. And I also, particularly with this work, it's much more of what I would call a mythic landscape. Just a little bit of history too, is prior to going to graduate school, I did a lot of plein air painting. I spent a lot of time painting out on the landscape. And when I went to graduate school, I swore I would never paint another landscape again. And this is what happened. And what I realized, that land and place are extremely important to me. And that transition to Illinois, and when I was painting there and I was sort of away from my home, I started imagining place. And in a sense, this is what I ended up with. I'm going to move on to another piece. This is a painting, or a monoprint, and it's called New Story. And one of the things I sort of like about monoprints is that you can make an image relatively quick. But also, if you're familiar with the process, you ink up a plate and then you simply lay the paper on it and you run it through the press. And that first image just never satisfied me. I was not happy with it. But, when I would look at the plate, I would see this ink that was left over. And that intrigued me because it was the residue. It was something from the past. And so I started cutting out these stencils of like the top, the elk, the crawdad, the megaphone, the weather siren, the sun, the lunchbox. And I started inking those up and I started dropping those over onto the paper and then actually running the paper through the press a second time. And there was something about this notion of the past and present coming together that really intrigued me. And I also think of that ink, um, on that plate as being sort of that residue, the existence of something from the past. And so I do think about my work as existing both in the past, the present, and hopefully in the future. And when I say that is I think good artwork, leads you to discovery. That sometimes you when you're painting or printing, you don't know what you're doing, and really you don't know what you're looking for. I don't like the notion of having a preconceived idea for a work, and it's those moments when things come together and you kind of go, aha! It surprises you. See something. It reveals something about who you are or how you look at the world. That's exciting. That collusion of heavenly structures painting that I showed a little bit earlier, one of the things that was important about that work is that it made me realize that actually I was dealing with the politics of place. And I think as a native person, you can't separate yourself from land, or at least I can't. And the fact is that your lives are politicized from the minute you get that card, that CDIB card that has your blood quantum, on it. And so, I've always kind of somewhat resisted that because I don't think of my personality as being an activist. But yet, I do address political issues, in the work. And that's, as I said, is very important to me. Move on to another piece here. This is actually one of the first Okesa paintings. And as I said, you start to see these images of the top of that tree trunk, of the map. You see a representation of the physical landscape and these roads, the sun image and acorns, and also this kind of rock cairn at the very bottom, and the satellite telescope. And so this particular piece, I started realizing that I was putting together all these sort of representations of land and was communicating again this kind of story. I like that trunk. And one of the things about that tree trunk, it's sitting in between places. It's in between earth and sky. And again, when you think about Okesa, halfway there, it's sort of between these places. I have to say, as a native person, I've always struggled with this issue of having to leave home to work and then also being at home. And so sometimes there's this kind of feeling that I'm always moving in between places. The images and symbols that I work with too is that I hope that they have multiple meanings, depending on the context that they're used. And when I say that is that I want them to grow and evolve and change, just like how we change in life. They shouldn't be stop signs, because then that means the symbol is sort of dead. And also when I look at that trunk, I'm not necessarily a skinny guy. That trunk, feels like my torso. It feels like me. The roots are sort of disconnected, but they're reaching out. The limbs are sort of cut off. It's somewhere just hovering in this place. Going to move on to another piece here, and this is Okesa 2. And this, I think, is a very important painting, for me, in the sense that we see the map, we see the elk, and we see that representation of the physical landscape where I was raised. And what I start to look at when I see this is I realize this is an Osage landscape because it shows the physical land where I come from. It shows the map, which is a result of colonialism. And if you take a look at a lot of the maps that I use in my work, I actually erased the border between Kansas and Oklahoma. And then I'm using this elk image. And the elk comes from one of our creation stories about the formation of the earth in dry land. And particularly, you know, it's a fairly long story, but it talks about how the elk called upon the winds and it blew the water into a mist. And there was sort of this violent action. And then what happened is we ended up with dry land to live on. In that struggle, what happens is that, you know, there's, like for instance, the hair of the elk gets embedded in the mud and that becomes grass and the antlers become rivers. And so, and the various other parts represent parts of the land. But what strikes me about this is that that animal is really sort of a symbol for various physical aspects of land, and it's like a map. The other thing too that sort of strikes me about using the elk is that you think about it, the elk roam the prairies. You know, at Contact, we were in Missouri, and elk were all over Missouri at one time. And if you think about it, with this whole sort of movement westward and expansion and how the land developed, the elk also got displaced too, just like many native peoples. And so this map, this image, you know, as I said, really begins to talk about a lot of those kind of elements. Another thing too is you see that sort of those acorns, and those acorns, I always think about rebirth, you know, that paintings, you know, should have this sense of hope, you know, to them. So I like to put the acorns in there because it sort of acknowledges, you know, the fact that something can grow again. And yeah. This is another image I want to talk about that I utilize in my prints quite a bit. And it's titled The People and Island Which Have Been Discovered. And it's a German woodcut from around 1505. And what caught my attention about this image is that it's supposedly it's the first ethnographically correct image of people from the New World. And you know, when I look at the image, you know, there's so many discrepancies here. I mean, the first thing that I sort of see when I'm looking at it are these figures. And you see the sort of chief figure here, you know, with his hand kind of over his heart standing, you know, in that pose. You see the mother and the child. You see the two figures sort of consoling each other. You see a lustful couple in the back, and you see this cannibalism. Also, if you take a look at the images, most of the men have full beards. And of course, they're wearing these sort of feathered headdresses. And you start to realize that even in this print, you know, is some of the basis for a lot of the stereotypes that kind of exist still to this day. I mean, the feathered headdress sort of becoming a marker for Native people in a sense. And yet too, you know, when I look at the work, you know, you see those two ships in the background. And from my perspective, that's the most important part of that work because it acknowledges that the world is about to change for Indigenous people in the Americas. And then also at the same time, on a formal level, when you look at the composition, you realize it's organized very much like a European, you know, work. And so to me, there's really nothing about this that's indigenous. It's sort of like white people being dressing up as Indians. And so, as I said, but it's an image that has intrigued me for quite a while. I'm going to move on to another print. this is a piece called New Company. And you see that inset image in the background. At this point, I'm also appropriating and collecting a lot of other images. The red image that you see of the sort of typical kind of Northern Plains native person, but it looks like he's playing sort of this cochiti drum. And that was actually came from, it was a small illustration in a dictionary for the word tom. And I think about that because, you know, I know at least in our culture, that drum has a very special significance to us. I mean, we even address it as grandfather, you know, in our Yolonska, but yet, you know, you see this image and it said, it's that word tom. And it just, you know, sort of caught my attention here. Also, one of the things you begin to see in this is the map, and you see these sort of figures of Hamilton, Grant, and Washington. And I started kind of thinking about how they sort of connect back to those ships in the background. And, you know, in a tongue-in-cheek kind of humorous way, I put them in these flying saucers to sort of kind of denote that they're aliens kind of moving through this landscape. And yet there's sort of this weird kind of welcoming that happens. And you know, one of the things I have to sort of say too is I'm intrigued with this notion of indigenous, native, alien, you know, those kind of terms that define people. You know, something that strikes me about this is that, you know, when you know, years ago, when they first started kind of talking about the wall, and that discussion about the wall's been going on for years. It's not something recent. And, you know, what I started thinking about is when you create those walls, you separate indigenous people from their homeland. In some cases, I mean, particularly if you're looking at Mexico and the United States. And so, you know, this is that kind of notion, who's an alien? You know, I think Americans have this tendency to sort of forget about history. And that, you know, they just, as I said, they kind of conveniently forget at times. You know, one of the things that you have to realize is that people immigrate. They move from one place to another. They leave their home to go to a new place because of a human element. They simply want to try to find and make a better life for their family. And that's what the Irish, that's what the Germans, that's what all these people did when they came to America. And there's a human element there that sort of that I sort of become aware of, you know, when I think about this. So you know, that's also why I chose these historic figures from U.S. currency too, you know, because it reflects that. I'm going to move on to another piece here. It's called By the Sword. This is a little bit darker kind of image of conquest. You see the conquistador. You see this kind of map of a ship and also the interior of a cathedral. And I have to admit, I get a little conflicted about a lot of my work there, you know, too, is that, you know, it's, you know, having the cathedral in there, you know, is kind of an interesting space for all of this to exist. And the reality is, you know, this whole sort of movement, you know, there was a lot of negative things that happened, you know, with this. And as I said, but I always have conflicted issues with that. Show one other image here. This one's called Two Houses. I've utilized birds an awful lot in my work. And part of that is because birds are about, you know, they move and they sort of operate in a space that I can't physically operate. And when I was a kid, I loved watching them fly. And I could always imagine that sense of moving through the space. But also birds migrate. they move from one place to another seasonally. And that kind of echoes a lot of my own movements, because in the spring, I start coming back home to take care of things. In June, we dance for a whole month at the three different villages at Gray Horse, Hominy, and Pahuska. And that cycle is just something that's a part of my life. You know, I look at kind of June as being kind of the beginning of the new year for me. In the wintertime, in the spring, I'm sort of feeling exhausted. And yet, when we dance in June, as I said, there's this sense of being connected. And you sort of feel like, yes, I can move on. I've got enough that I can move on for that next year. This is a lithograph called Alien Conquest. And again, you start to see, some of the images of the flying saucers, and also the money and that. I'll show a couple more of these images too, real quick, and then another piece called Dark Rain. One of the things that I have to say about printmaking is that I think painting is actually a very lonely, solitary activity. And printmaking has always sort of afforded me the opportunity to work in a shop or to work with a printer. And I've been fortunate that I've been working with a printer named Mitchell Marty for now, God, 15 years plus at this point. And I always like that collaboration, and part of that is because we're working on prints, but we're having these conversations, and they're rich conversations, that sort of, when I leave those sessions, I feel really, really good. And so that notion of collaborating on these prints, because I will say I do not have the skills to pull my own lithographs. And so we're working with these. And I also kind of like this dialogue that we have, that he kind of, I may say, well, I want to do this, and I might get that look like, no, you can't. And I'm kind of going, hey, I'm a painter, keep that in mind. And so we have this sort of play back and forth. But this is Dark Rain print. And this is another piece called Little House Effect. And you see the map of Kansas and Oklahoma. You see the little houses. One of the things I'll sort of say is that the Osage Diminished Reserve was in southeast Kansas, and it was and going to central Kansas, and it was just a long, narrow strip of land that was designated as our home. And when you think about it, for indigenous people who were used to moving across land, to being confined to a long, narrow strip was very sort of kind of, it was just very sort of restricting, for the most part. And so we lived on this strip of land for a good while before we were moved to Oklahoma in 1870. And of course, that notion of the little house effect, I was kind of thinking about the little house on the prairie. And of course, Laura Ingalls Wilder's, that family, they were actually squatters, on the Osage Diminished Reserve. And the Osages were kind of in an interesting sort of situation too, because at the end of the Civil War, the government did realize that part of us sort of supported the Union and part of us supported the Confederacy. And we played a role in Southeast Kansas, with keeping the Confederacy out, for the most part. And one of the things I will say about Osage people too, in general, is that we've always and had been politically strong, and we were good diplomats, when we were working with people. We allied with the French early on, too, as well. And so that's kind of a part of our history. But here's this lithograph called Little House Effect. You also sort of see the cedar trees that are sort of floating in that field, and you across the picture plane. And I always think about how farmers, sort of look at cedar trees as a nuisance, and they want to get rid of them, for the most part too as well. This is a piece called Interference in a Tiny Spot of Hope. Several years ago, we started getting windmills on our land, and I have to admit, it was a little disconcerting to me because I've always had this sort of I've loved that point where earth and sky meet on the prairie, and how you get that atmospheric perspective that happens there, and things kind of get blurred. And I like that point because it's kind of ambiguous. And yet, when the windmill started coming up, that sort of view disappeared. It was obstructed. And I started thinking about how there's certain points where you can look at the windmills and it almost feels like the blades are cutting into the land, a bit, that it's kind of disturbing place. It's a little hard to see, but there's areas within the landscape that you start to see bones and sort of artifacts, and I was kind of thinking about repatriation and how our lands have just really sort of been, as I said, kind of decimated, for the most part. And of course, you see the tree trunks that have been, the trees have been severed as well. The elk is being flipped upside down and is sort of sitting in between places. And yet the most important part of this painting to me is that little sun that's up in the upper portion of the painting. I'm going to move on to a few more pieces, and these are actually recent works that were done really during COVID. In kind of March, April, May, and June, and July. And I have to admit, I didn't realize that COVID would have as much of an impact on me, and it did. And so, so this was a piece called "Crying Elk," and it's kind of a return back to this more painterly painting for me. And this is a fairly large-scale piece. It's a little hard to see, but there's little COVID sort of illustrations floating in the space behind it. And again, the acorns is sort of a sign of hope, for the most part. I'm going to move on to another piece here. This is called Drowning Elk. And I think, in these works, as I said, there's a little bit more of an expressive element. And I'm starting to also realize I'm looking at kind of environmental issues. You think about the sheer waste of plastic water bottles, and what that's doing to our land, our seas, and that. I was on sabbatical, and so I was back at home working. And one of the things I started realizing, I was drinking bottled water pretty much most of the time, because the town where I live, the water is just bad, and I can remember at a time when it was good, for the most part. And so this is the piece called Drowning Elk. Go move on to one other piece here, and this is called Dripping World. And again, you see the elk, you see the map, you see this sort of, you see the pipes, you see this sort of rusty kind of bad water, you see the oil, you see this pipeline, and these paintings really, as I said, are beginning to kind of open up a new dialogue for me, in the work, and I feel like I'm beginning to kind of touch base on sort of more environmental issues. And so, yeah. And this is actually the last image I have in my slide talk. So, so maybe if we want to transition, we can, I can answer some questions if you have some. And so I will move out of screen share at this point. And thank you for the opportunity to share my work.
Thank you, Norman. Here's Mary Frances Ivy, a member of the History of Art Graduate Students Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. And do we have questions from our viewers for Norman?
We have lots of great questions. Thank you for your wonderful talk. People are so interested and engaged. One of the first questions for you is so eloquent, I'll read it just as the writer has shared it. As you travel those gravel and dirt roads back home, do you find the journey engages all your senses? What sounds, sights, smells, etc. do you associate with home, in quotes?
You know, it's interesting. I travel a lot, and I will tell you something. I never have the radio on. I don't listen to music. I don't listen to the radio at all when I travel. I mean, even if I'm doing a 10-hour trip. I am always fascinated with the sound of the road and that connection to earth on that vehicle and those shifts in sound. You know, when you're going from a paved road to a gravel road, or you switch to a different type of dirt road, that always intrigues me. And there's something very soothing too, I think, about traveling. I find that while I'm still engaged with looking at the road, of course, is that sense of looking is really is just kind of heightened. And I find too and that's something I tell my students a lot of times. As I said, you know, when you're walking and you're moving from one place to another, you should be engaged in looking, because so much of the time we just are concerned about getting from point A to point B, and we don't get that experience. And of course, you know, there's things that happen. It's like that transition of moving from Kansas to Oklahoma. I'm thinking about the history of our ancestors, that movement. But I'm also, you know, sometimes, you know, in my travels, because I do drive around Southeast Kansas quite a bit. And I watch and I look at the landscape. And of course, you realize that the landscape has been, you know, farmed, and it's changed so much, you know, since the 1860s. You know, it's not the same landscape. But every once in a while, I'll look and I'll see something and I'll think, the ancestors saw that. You know, that's still there. And I think that really kind of that intrigues me. You know, so I mean, yeah, I mean, it's just something. Yeah, I feel like my senses are completely engaged. You know, and that I have to say, and I love stories. And I remembered one time I was driving from New Mexico to Oklahoma, and it was in August, and it was just hot. I mean, it was just brutally hot. And one of the things that I noticed is that I wasn't seeing any birds. And it was kind of bothering me, because I was used to seeing birds along the side of the road. And then I took a closer look, and because there's no trees out in the panhandle, it's relatively flat. The birds were congregating in the shadows of the light poles. And so they were kind of hidden in that shadow. And I think those are kind of those things that you have to, you know, there's some joy in seeing that. Anyway, I hope that kind of answered the question there. I mean, I could probably go on and on about other experiences too, you know, traveling, but I'm sure there's probably some more.
I think that was a wonderful answer. And I think it's a perfect segue to another question. One viewer asked, what do you think your artistic practice has helped you to understand about the world you live in, as you put it?
You know, it's when my artistic practice, when my painting is good, I don't know what I'm painting. Now, that may seem kind of ironic, because I'm dealing with this set of personal symbols, because they are a part of that story that I'm communicating. But sometimes they come together, and what happens is I discover something new. And that's always the exciting part about making art, is that moment of sort of going, oh God, I really painted that? I did that? I think that way. You know, sometimes it's good. Sometimes you're kind of going, oh, do I really think that way? And so you know, that's you know, I think a lot of when I look at my work, um, I look at the notion of identity. I look at the notion of place, and I'm trying to define that. I mean, I know who I am. That's not an issue, you know, here. But I'm always intrigued with how I sort of fit into place, you know, for the most part. Um, as I said, I'm not interested in illustrating the past. Well, you know, what I'm interested in is sort of trying to understand the world I'm living in now at this point. And when a painting is really good, it starts to reflect something that's happening at this point. You know, it's kind of like those water bottles. I never thought I would be painting water bottles. That's the first painting I've ever painted in the water bottles. And I just started realizing after several months of drinking bottled water because I felt like I couldn't drink the town water, you know, that was important to me. But the entrance of that, and one of the things I'll sort of say about symbols and images is that sometimes something enters your work and you don't know why it is there. And it may stay in the work for a while. And it may disappear. You may not ever use that image again. And then sometimes it carries on. You know, and that's kind of that notion of collecting and looking and finding and trying to find what's important. I always say this too, is that sometimes when you put something in a work, like, and it doesn't have any meaning, it doesn't mean that it's meaningless. It just means that maybe you don't have enough experience to understand why it's there. And that what happens is that there's a cyclical nature, I think, to work. We kind of go back. You know, we do this. And each time we circle around, we gather more information, and we begin to understand. And so that's really how I tend to think about painting, for the most part. I like the notion of the invisible. One of the things I will sort of say about my work is that I do deal with a fair amount of cultural information in the paintings, but it's coded and it's layered. And one of the reasons why I do that is that I have concerns about cultural appropriation in many cases, and then also I like that notion of layering and embedding meaning because as people are looking at the work, they start to read the work differently. As a visual artist, I have to make work that engages people. And I have to communicate ideas. But in that layering, what happens is that each person's going to read that work a little bit differently. And someone with a similar history might look at an image and go, I get it. And so those are some of the things I think about. I remembered when I came back from graduate school, I had these large scale abstract expressionist paintings or expressionist paintings. And I was dealing with the symbolism and everything. And our little town, the town where I was raised, has about 12 to 1,500 people in it. It's a small rural community. Most people ranch, or they work for the agency, or when the oil production was good, they worked for the oil companies and that. But it's a small community. And I remember I put the work up in a vacant storefront, and we did a little show. And this was back in the 1990s. And there was an elderly lady who came in, and she looked at the work and she was kind of scrutinizing it. She remembered when I did the little landscapes and I painted all around home. And then she came up to me and she said, I know what your paintings are about. She said, you miss your people, you miss home. And that made me feel good, because she saw through all of this sort of art history and she got it. She saw through this kind of expressionist painting and she got it. And you know, and I think there's moments like that, and like that man that I told you about earlier, that when they do that, you know that someone believes in you. And you know something, we live in a world that, you know, it's important to have someone believe in you. And so, you know, I think about those people and I realize that they've got me to this point just because they said a few words. And that's, you know, that's meaningful. You know, so when I think back and I look back, I think about those people. I say they may not realize what they did, but they did an awful lot for me. And so, you know, that's, I am kind of digressing maybe a little bit from the question, but you know, that's really how I look at the work.
Mary Frances, your mic isn't on.
Thank
That
you
was
for-
bound to happen sooner or later, wasn't it?
I know. Thank you for telling me that. Norman, I was enjoying your answers so much that I was murmuring and nodding and, you know, all those things along. So I had to mute myself. Several folks commented on a sense of hope in your work, or asked about that rather. Could you speak to that more, how you represent that sense of hope or that sense of missing?
Well, you know,
So-
I think paintings have to be hopeful. I mean, of course, some of those symbols, it said like the acorn, you know, that little seed is about growth, you know, there. I will sort of say this, and I'm, you know, I didn't show any of the works, but I do know that a lot of my works from the 90s, there was an anger that was kind of driving them, you know, that it was about frustration, it was about disconnect. And you know, that was kind of fueling the work. And then things kind of changed, and I started realizing that I actually didn't want to paint those paintings anymore. And I will say there was a period for a couple of years I just kind of quit painting because I thought the paintings were ugly. You know, for the most part, I thought they were good paintings, but I just thought they were ugly, and I didn't want to be in that space anymore. And so I started restructuring these paintings, and I do think about paintings as that they should be hopeful, you know, for the most part. You know, those two images of the landscape, and I talked about romanticizing place. I mean, there's a reality, kind of a harsh reality to home, you know, at times. And there's a balance between those two. And I just think I'm at an age now where I don't want to dwell on that, you know, that paintings are about hope. I didn't show a painting here, and I'm probably revealing maybe too much that's personal, but I feel like I kind of feel like this might be a time that I could do that. You know, I lost my father many years ago, and it was a violent act, and I was mad for a long time at people, and I wanted to make a painting about it. But every time I made a painting, it was just angry. And I didn't want to live with that. And then one day, I always remembered he would look at me and he would joke. He said, I'm going to go to that place. I'm going to go to that place. And he would point up. And you know, and I knew what he was talking about. And then one day I was painting that creation story, and I painted, he used to have a T-bird that I remembered driving around on the prairie with him when I was little. And I put that T-bird in that painting, and it's sort of moving up into the sky, up into the sun. And it was just simply a painting called I Hope You Got There. And, you know, that changed my whole sort of view on that incident. And it was really very much about hope, you know. But no, I think that's something as you kind of get older, and I've realized more and more is that you know, I want to dwell in an optimistic place and not something negative. Any other questions? Your
Um,
mic.
Okay, I'm not muted this time. A question for you about the inaccessibility of travel, particularly in these last few months. You mentioned June and the month of dances. Wondered
Yeah.
if you could speak to that.
Well, first of all, for us, many things have been canceled. Our dances at Grey Horse were canceled, this year because we just couldn't do that. Yeah, same way with the Huska. Um, um, no, I miss being on the road. That's one of the things that kind of bothers me a bit. But also at the same time, I was connected with home, and so it doesn't bother me. I still travel around on roads. I go out into the landscape. I look. There's places at home during COVID I could go and I could actually get up into the hills and not see anything. And there was something quite soothing about that solitary nature, or that solitary sort of feeling of being out in nature. And I have to admit, I'm generally, you're hearing me talk quite a bit. I'm usually pretty quiet, actually. And so solitude is something that doesn't bother me a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Norman.
You're welcome.
Do we have any more questions, Mary Frances?
We have more questions, so we could keep going if Norman has time, or if we need to let our audience go. That could be
I'm here. You have me.
Maybe a couple more. Yeah.
Okay. Norman, a question for you about the sense of maps being alive, or rather, might you consider maps being alive?
I think, if you look at just over time, borders and boundaries change, they evolve, too, as well. I mean, I definitely think there's that potential that they're constantly kind of moving. It's, and even I was talking to someone a while back, and this person made the comment. They said, well, you're cutting out and you're collaging, you're picking up a piece of the landscape and you're moving it and you're repositioning it, into a new place. And I actually, for some reason, I hadn't been thinking about that, but that's that kind of sense of borders and boundaries moving. But too, is, you look at nature. I mean, you look at rivers over a period of time, they change course. And those, it's funny. I don't know if I'm really answering that question in it, but I will sort of say something. It's kind of like that border between Kansas and Oklahoma. It's fixed for the most part. And so when I travel through there, I'm aware of that because of the signage, when I'm on the highway. But I also look at the Arkansas River borders the southern part of our land. And I know through my life, I've watched the erosion on the banks, and I've watched it change. And I've seen good sections of pasture actually disappear to the river over 40 years, 50 years. And so that's a sense of if you think about the river as being a marker on a map, it begins to change. Yeah.
Perhaps the last question, and this is my question to you. I wonder about new directions for your work, that evolving landscape or map of your work, new motifs, new questions, new directions for you.
I think in the recent work, the last three pieces that I showed you, I see something new happening, and I don't know where it's going right now. For me, the last thing I would want to say is, oh, I'm going to be an environmental painter and I'm going to deal with environmental issues, because that's kind of telling me where the work is going to go. And right now, I just want to sort of get a sense of, I don't know. I hate to say that, but I think that's probably the best place to be at this point. You know, part of this too, I will say, I had been doing a lot of printmaking, and so in this last year, I finally started returning back to painting. And I was talking to actually someone today, and I said, you know, it'd been a while since I was painting, and I was actually having to kind of get my chops back, you know, a little bit. And then, you know, there's that, you know, dilemma that happens is like, do you want to sort of paint what you painted before in the past because it's comforting and you know you can do it, you know, or do you want to try something new? And then sometimes you have to work through that history to get to someplace new. I know earlier this year, I started a bunch of painting. I was trying to do something new, and I completely they collapsed on me, and I couldn't get them back. And that was, you know, it was kind of a challenge, you know, for me. And some of it was interesting because I was trying to go back to something old and this feeling that I had. And I wanted to recreate it. And I realized I actually couldn't do it because I wasn't the same person. And so I had to kind of move on to something else. And the pipes, the water bottles, that's new for me. The lifeboat, which is kind of floating in there, that's interesting to me too. And I'm just really kind of anxious to see where things go. Yeah.
David, this time you're muted.
We look forward, Norman, also to seeing where your work goes. We've really, it's been a privilege for us to go on this journey with you this evening through some of your work, your ideas, your process, your themes, your concepts, your exploration of your heritage, of your place. And you talked about how you want your art to be open to multiple interpretations. And that's really inviting us, I think, to continue the exploration on our own. Everyone should go and see your current show at Sherry Leedy Contemporary, where I think we can see in person some of the paintings that you showed us this evening.
Yeah, the last three works are up there.
Right. So put on your mask and go into Kansas City and see the work in person. Thank you so much, Norman. Thank you, everyone who's been with us on YouTube this evening. This was the first lecture in our series. We have several more coming up, so watch social media for details. The next one will be on October 29th when M. Carmen Lane will be joining us. And we thank you all for your questions, for your engagement, again, for being with us, and wish you all a good evening. Thanks again.
Oh, you're welcome.